Hi, everybody. Shavua Tov. This is Eve Harrow on Rejuvenation for the Land of Israel Network. It is a beautiful day in Jerusalem, July 8th, 2018, the 25th day of Tammuz, 5778. A few days ago, on July 3rd, I was in the Knesset, along with some of our other friends, Josh Haston and Gil Hoffman and others, and I was invited to a very interesting meeting of the Victory Caucus in the Knesset, and you're going to hear about that in the next few minutes. The Victory Caucus, the members of Knesset who are in charge of it here, Oded Forer, Elazar Stern, and Avraham Negosa, and the topic is 25 years of Oslo, time for new thinking. So they had many guests there, and the particular one whose was so important and whose contribution was so heartfelt was Stuart Force, the father of Taylor Force, who was murdered by Palestinian Arab terrorists a few years ago, and whose death galvanized the forces and also American legislators and Israelis to finally pass some legislation, what they call to stop the pay to slay. And so the first voice that you are going to be hearing now that I recorded in the Knesset on July 3rd is that of Stuart Force. The first couple of minutes of Stuart Force speaking was a very poor recording. I was too far from him. Then I managed to get over there and put, actually, thanks to Ashley Perry, have the mic closer to him. But he said some things that I hadn't known. Maybe you guys knew it. That Taylor was very interested in Judaism. He had gone to a Shabbat dinner. He had friends who were Jewish. He was intrigued by our history, by the Jewish people, by Israel. He had also paid a visit to a concentration camp and had, of course, been horrified by what happened in the 20th century, by the genocide against the Jewish people. And that was all the lead up to his trip here to Israel and why he was just so excited to come here. He was not just another tourist. And so here's Stuart Force talking about his son, Taylor.
I've been following him on Facebook since the trip because he was such a fine young man. I enjoyed talking with him about our families and about what we experienced. So when the opportunity came up to take a student trip to Israel, he jumped at it. That's why he was here. People ask a couple questions of us. First one is, what was Taylor like? And if I can share that with you just for a moment. I always use the comparison of a glass of water on a table, half full. Well, a pessimist would say the glass is half empty. An optimist would say the glass is half full. An engineer, of course, would say the glass is twice as big as it needs to be. Taylor was a systems engineer, so he was quick to point out that there was a lot of unnecessary glass holding that water. But Taylor's glass was always full. It was full of life, and he shared it with everybody. And I've felt that since I've been in Israel. This is a country that's full of life, that they cherish life. And when Robbie and I, my wife and I, were given the opportunity shortly after we lost Taylor to join a project which became the Taylor Force Act that would stop the flow of money to the Palestinian Authority that's used to support terrorism, we quickly agreed. And through Senator Graham, Sandra Gerber, most of you know Sandra Gerber, but Senator Graham and our South Carolina senator, as it turns out, coincidentally, that's where we live, Charleston, and Congressman Doug Lamborn of Colorado, through their efforts and us just showing up in offices and asking for the votes of the members of the Senate and the Congress, we got it passed. Now, one of the parts of the Taylor Force Act that don't often get discussed, other than the withholding of the money until they stop paying terrorists, one of the purposes of the Taylor Force Act is for the Palestinian Authority to renounce terrorism, not just stop it, but just to renounce it and say that that's not what they believe in anymore. And that's equally important to the law's passage. Yesterday was a good day. We not only heard that the Knesset, well, we were in the audience when the Knesset passed it, but we also heard early in the day that the Australian government had implemented policies to do the same. People ask another question: now that the act is passed, what are your plans? And I go back to one thing Senator Graham told us when Robbie and I, my wife and I, went up for the press conference introducing the legislation. We went into Senator Graham's office, first time we'd met him face to face. I'd spoken on the phone with him many times. So we sat down in his office, just the three of us, and little chit-chat. And then Senator Graham looked at Robbie and I and said, "Stuart and Robbie, how are you really doing?" Taylor had been on 2 combat deployments, one to Iraq, one to Afghanistan, one for 9 months, one for a year. He had brought his troops back successfully, and in his mind, successfully means accomplishing the mission and bringing all the troops back home safely. So we told Senator Graham, "Senator, we feel that our son is still on deployment and that he'll be coming home any day." And he said something so profound. He said, "Stuart, Robbie, it's you and Robbie that are on deployment. Taylor is home, and you'll be going home soon, all too soon." And that put things in perspective. He was home. So Robbie and I have dedicated the rest of our deployment to items like the Taylor Force Act and doing what we can. We're very few times, I think, in our lives have we had the opportunity to do something to benefit other people. When this opportunity came up, and especially so personal, we jumped at it. And we appreciate the support we've received from the Israelis, the Israeli state, the Israeli people, the Jewish community in the United States, the Christian community, people we've never met. Friends, family, strangers have embraced us, and it's enabled us to make it through. And I thank you. It's a good opportunity for me to tell everyone. Thank you.
Okay, now we are going to hear from Daniel Pipes, the head of the MidEast Forum and one of the major players here on the U.S. side for the Victory Caucus. His voice is pretty faint, but it was really important for him to be at the Knesset, and he made a huge effort. And here is Daniel Pipes.
I'd like to start with my condolences to you, Mr. Force, and thank you for the inspiration that you've provided to the U.S. Congress, Israeli Knesset, and I hope further legislatures ahead. The Knesset Israel Victory Caucus, or lobby, now has 26 members, led by the 3 gentlemen you've seen here. That has been accomplished in part by the members of Knesset, but also in part by the MidEast Forum's Israel Victory team, starting with Gregg Roman and Ashley Perry and Alex Sexy, who have done an extraordinary job in creating interest and finding support. But I would argue to you that 26 is just getting started. Still a long way to go to 120. Now you might say that's impossible. This is an idea that could not ever appeal across the board to all members of Knesset. Well, practically speaking, you're probably right. But theoretically speaking, let me make the point why it can be attractive to all members of Knesset. And there are 2 reasons. The first is that this approach of ending the Palestinian dream of eliminating the Jewish state is not only good for Israel, which obviously it is, but it is also good for the Palestinians. The Palestinians have for nearly a century now been under the sway of what we call rejectionism. I date it to 1921. The rejection of the Jewish state, the rejection of Zionism, the rejection of anything having to do with what is today Israel. This has been a tremendous burden on the Palestinians, who have suffered enormously. And if you compare, say, Jerusalem and Ramallah, the contrast is obvious. So not only is Israel Victory good for Israel, but I would argue it's even better for the Palestinians, who once liberated from this obsession with destroying the Jewish state can go on to build their own polity, economy, society, and culture. Secondly, the Israel victory idea has universal appeal because it is what we call solution agnostic. There is no result coming out of this. We go up to the point that the Palestinians say, okay, we accept there is an Israel. What comes next? We don't discuss. Individually, we might have opinions. Of course, we have opinions. But as an organization, we don't go further. In other words, if you want a complete withdrawal to the 67 lines, it works. It means that Israel, within those lines, will not be assaulted by its neighbor. If you wish to have Israeli sovereignty over the entire West Bank, it works. And anything in between, two-state, not two-state, sovereignty, not sovereignty, this leads up to the possibility of any kind of solution. And we are very careful not to prejudge, not to draw conclusions about what the solution can be. So from right to left, everyone can agree. Getting Palestinian acceptance of Israel is the first step. The second step, we don't take. So, an event like this is an inspiration for us to work harder, to bring in more Knesset members, to find more support outside the Knesset, to work harder in the United States to find more support, so that one day, our goal, because we're an American organization, one day an American president will say to his aides, these peace plans aren't working. We've had 30 years of diplomacy. It's achieved nothing. Is there an alternative? And those aides will say, yes. There is one worked out alternative, intellectually serious and politically supported, and it's Israel victory.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're now listening to Arab Jabari, a businessman and community leader from Hevron. I'm going to be simultaneously translating. He spoke in Hebrew, and I'll also be adding in because I didn't catch everything that he said. Today, I don't want to talk about history. I want to just talk about to the years 1993 through the present. 25 years under the Palestinian Authority. What have we succeeded in doing? Where have we gone from here? Right, and now this is Eve, because I didn't tape everything that he said. And he says that they don't need citizenship. The Arabs of Judea and Samaria don't need Israeli citizenship. They need good day-to-day life. They want to be connected with Israel, with the medical system, with the advances. They understand that Israel is a Western open democracy in the Middle East. And so for them to still be able to live in the Middle East, but also have the advantages of the Western world is what they want. And that's what Israel provides for them. And this reminded me of a conversation that I had last year in an airport with, it wasn't here in the Middle East, it was somewhere else. I happened to have a conversation with somebody from one of the cities in the Palestinian Authority. I believe it was Ramallah. And I was talking to him in the way that you can really talk to people when they trust you. Even though we had just met, he sensed right away that I live here too, and I just want everything to be good for all of us and for all of our children. And I said to him, well, but you guys want citizenship, right? We've got these whole issues that if Israel puts sovereignty on Judea and Samaria and in all these cities, then what do we do about the demographics, and what do we do with the Arabs? Not if we don't give them citizenship, everybody's going to scream apartheid. But if we do, then it undermines demographically, it undermines Israel. And he said to me, I don't want to have an Israeli passport. He said, I want to have the advantages of living near Israel. He said, my daughter lives in Qatar. He said, if I have an Israeli passport, I can't go visit her. Do you see what's going on here? So we keep saying, because again, we keep projecting our values, and they want to have passports, but they don't want to have an Israeli passport because they want to be able to travel around the Middle East to places that don't accept Israeli passport. My Israeli passport doesn't get me in anywhere in the Middle East, all right? Where Israel's an island that way. So they want to have a passport that's, let's say, Jordanian or another country. So we have to listen and find the middle ground instead of going to the extremes on either side. If we can't go all the way and give them everything, then there's nowhere to go. But they're not saying that. Many of us are just putting that in their mouths, myself included. All right. So that was a really eye-opening conversation. And when I heard Sheikh Farid al-Jabari from Hevron, and he's spoken about this before, and he's at the Israeli Knesset and saying this, then maybe then it fills me with hope. Because if we just really start listening in a true way to what other people want, we can perhaps find a way out of this muddle, but certainly not when there's terror and violence hanging over everybody. And that's what this Victory Caucus was about, and what the legislation being passed in different countries is about, is ending that. I'm sitting with Gregg Roman, who's the director of the MidEast Forum. We just came out of the Knesset committee, which he was very involved with arranging. So exactly what was this Victory Caucus, and what is the connection also between American Congress? Stuart Force was here, the father of Taylor Force, some really great people in that room. Even gave me some hope that maybe things are looking up. So Gregg, please tell us, how were you involved with what happened here today in the Knesset?
Sure. So about 18 years ago, Daniel Pipes, the president of the MidEast Forum, an organization that promotes American interests in the Middle East and defends the West from threats emanating from that region, put together an idea about 6 years after the Oslo Accords that the negotiations weren't working, that every time there was an offer for the Palestinians and they said no, they were rewarded instead of saying yes and then subsequently being rewarded. So it took about 17 years between the crystallization of this idea that Daniel had about the idea in victory. Wars end not when one side declares victory, but when one side recognizes defeat, that there would be a way to operationalize it. And it was a combination of the ascension of President Trump. Now, this project started before the election, the 2016 presidential election. It started before the current round of violence and conflict that's taking place in Gaza after Operation Protective Edge. But with the idea, I guess the foresight, that if we could, on one hand, convince the Israeli government, the Israeli public, Israeli institutions, the army, veterans, teachers, students, professors, that the way in which they could most easily solve the conflict with the least amount of blood being spilled. And on the other side, convince the American administration, whether it would be Clinton or Trump, that the Oslo paradigm that had been going on since 92 or 93, or arguably since 1974 with Kilometer 101, when we were having the Stevens Plan or Christopher Plan, that with Israel in a position of strength, the U.S. would say to it, go win your war. Do what you have to do to have the Palestinians recognize that there's a Jewish state next door to them, that it wasn't coming with a demand for one state or two states or three states, or some people have ideas of 8 states or taking pieces of Egypt and Jordan. It was a solution agnostic methodology and strategy for bringing the Palestinians to capitulate on their rejectionism. So the taking of the idea and turning it into a policy mechanism required us to partner with members of the Knesset to create a caucus here, which is a vehicle for putting legislation forth which would increase the pressure on the Palestinians, like the Taylor Force Act, which cuts payments to Palestinian terrorists sitting in Israeli jails. On the American side, the caucus was involved, the Congressional Israel Victory Caucus, the Knesset's legislative partner. On the Israeli side, it was involved in stopping the transfer of tax receipts that Israel collects on behalf of the Palestinian Authority from going to Palestinian coffers that would eventually go to the Palestinian Prisoners Club. That's the name of the fund, and the other is the Palestinian Prisoners Fund. So that is one example of dozens of different initiatives that are taking place in the legislature, in the military, in civil society, on both sides of the Atlantic, to forward this victory paradigm as one to replace the failed Oslo narrative.
So, sometimes you think that the good people are all talking to ourselves. You know, the Americans also want there to be peace. We define peace the same way that the West does, which means nobody goes to war. There's not bloodshed on either side. It doesn't make me, as an Israeli mother, happy to see Arab mothers lose their children either. We don't want there to be war, period. So the Americans talk to the Israelis, and we try to get the Europeans involved, whatever their agenda is. The Australians are now doing good. Yesterday was a good day. But how do we convince the Arabs here that this is good for them? And it seems like we keep coming up against this all the time.
Right. Well, so if you deconstruct Palestinian rejectionism, there's really 4 parts of it. 2 parts Palestinian, 1 part international community, and 1 part the lack of Israeli strategy to deal with the problem. So on the Palestinian side, you have 1, which is Islamic doctrine, the idea that if this land was once held by Muslims, then it stays in Muslim hands.
Dar al-Islam.
Dar al-Harb al-Islam. But it's more of the idea of what we call waqfic mentality, the waqf, the idea of the Islamic Holy Trust. So if you want to argue against that and say there's never been a case where Muslims have given up land, I just tell you to look at the Balkans and to look at Spain. Andalusia, now it's Spain. They lost that back in 1492. The same application of strategy could be applied here. Not with the horrific means that actually went by to do that, but there's been cases of Muslims giving up land, specifically in this case Palestinian Muslims. The second idea associated with Palestinian rejectionism is called samud in Arabic. It's steadfastness. There's a lot of quotes if you look on Palestinian television, radio, even on Facebook, where they say, we can wait 3, 4, 500 years until we get to the point where we can defeat the Israelis. But if you take modern technology and you apply it with smart warfare, and I don't just mean warfare in terms of taking guns and artillery and tanks, but a cross-section of the application of different means to be able to convince an enemy that it's lost, you can energize the Israeli side to bring the Palestinians to capitulate. I mean, if you just look at the numbers now, the Palestinians are the most educated Arabs in the Middle East. They have the highest amount of university degrees. Their birth rate is starting to go down, as we see in societies. As the education rate goes up, birth rate goes down. They want to become part of the miracle that is Israel. Not to become Israeli citizens, but they want to benefit from all the great things going on the other side of the Green Line. And the third part is what sort of enables Palestinian Waqfic Islamic doctrine and samud, steadfastness, which is the support of the far left in the international community. Every time the Palestinians say no, they get some kind of solace coming from their donor communities and otherwise other places. But there's plenty of organizations that are working on that right now. You pointed out Australia, which unilaterally decided to stop a $43 million Australian dollar fund that was going to the World Bank. Now the Australians will only give it to organizations that care about Palestinian humanitarian concerns rather than political concerns. And the fourth issue is probably the most touchy, which is the positioning of the Israeli security apparatus in trying to keep the status quo instead of trying to break it and then to bring a resolution to the conflict on Israeli terms, which is essentially going from mowing the lawn to, burning the grass down.
Okay, are you specifically now referring to what's going on with Hamas and the burning kites and everything that's happening in the south and not so much Judea and Samaria, which is not quiet, but definitely quieter than it has been in the past?
Well, being an Israeli, I have my own perspectives, but also being an American, I would argue that it's incumbent upon me as a policy professional not to tell the army what to do, but to encourage them to take means that they may not be using right now to end these flying kites of terror. I mean, in my opinion, I think that the return to targeted assassinations and using within moral, humanitarian, and internationally legal means, Israel should do everything it has to discourage one kite, one Molotov cocktail from coming over the border. And right now, I think it's a combination of fear, of not trying to escalate the conflict, and of minimizing casualties to the Israeli side, that they're responding the way they are. But in the meantime, there's 1,800 dunams of Israeli agricultural land that's gone away, that's burned down, and agricultural prices for fruits and vegetables are skyrocketing.
Well, look, we're sitting in the Knesset, which I think you all know is really where the military echelon is going to get their marching orders from. It's not that they're going to decide on their own. It's this building and the politicians in here. And as somebody said in this room, which I thought was like, there was no answer for that. That room should have been full of 120 members of Knesset. There should not be one member of Knesset who is against this policy of saying that we have to declare victory.
I don't think that any Zionist members of Knesset would be against this. The United Arab List and Meretz are outliers that would inherently, I would argue, be more pro-Palestinian than pro-Israeli.
Right.
But just, ministers can't be members of caucuses. You can't have deputy ministers or committee chairs taking that position either. But those who were here representing Yesh Atid in the opposition, Likud, Yisrael Beitenu, there's members from the Labor Party, there's members from Shas, from Bayit Yehudi. Every Zionist party is represented in this legislative vehicle here. And I think that the assignments that they have representing their party's issues shows that every Zionist in this country is for the victory proposition. It's a great amalgamation of that support.
Well, it's pretty clear that Oslo is dead. We have to think out of the box, and you at least are trying to do that.
Well, it begins with somebody recognizing it. And then we have an idea that I think can transfer to a new paradigm that can be actually used to bring peace. I mean, I think Daniel said it best. The people that will benefit the most from this policy are not Israelis, it's Palestinians.
That's right. We're doing pretty well as a country, but we want our neighbors to do as what they can too. Okay, thank you, Gregg Roman. I know you have to go. You have other people waiting to interview. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we heard from Gregg Roman and from others. It was a fascinating day for me going into the Knesset. I've been to the Knesset so many times, and there's still a thrill. It's an exciting place to go. So many decisions are made. They're not all decisions that I agree with, but just the fact that Israel is a very vibrant democracy is something that I never take for granted. Definitely when you see what's happening, not just here in the Middle East, but in so many parts of the world, and in so many, a good chunk of the Southern Hemisphere, for example, and places like Russia and Turkey. We kind of assume that all places, that we know intellectually that it's not true, that most people can say what they want and live in free societies. When you live here in the Middle East, you see how not true that is by meeting people all the time who come from places where that's not so. You got to stop being sheltered people and really get out there and understand more of what's really happening in the world. So it's still always a thrill to go into the Knesset. And I was just very excited to be able to bring some of the real voices for you, to be able to get my tape recorder every once in a while. Thank you, Ashley Perry, a little bit close to the speakers and be able to bring you in their voices. And as I said at the beginning of the show, Stuart Force had to stop speaking a few times in order to rein in his emotions, but you could see it was palpable how much he cares about Israel and how much he understands that we're all on the same side here, and that he is going to do what we do so often here in Israel and turn a tragedy into really a force for good. And that way the memory of the person is first of all, the memory of the person never goes away, but that their death wasn't for nothing, and perhaps it'll prevent other deaths, and there will be some meaning to that. But you could see the pain, and you could hear it in his voice, you could definitely see it on his face. This is a man who lost his son, which is an experience that way too many of us here in Israel have had, and he knew that he was among people who understood very much what he and his wife were going through. So that was one of the things I did last week. I also had a wonderful day guiding in the southern Hevron Hills, a trip for One Israel Fund, where we went into the vineyards with Rav Moshe Hager Lau from the pre-army Mechina, the academy there, and picked grapes and made the special blessing, the tithing that one does on food that's picked only in the land of Israel, and how absolutely special that was. And I'm continuing my guiding. Tomorrow I start with another group for the Jewish Women's Renaissance Project, which I've spoken about before. A week with women who are coming to Israel, Jewish women who are coming to Israel to deepen their ties to Judaism, to the country, and to themselves, to each other, and find out what it's all about. So tremendous privilege to be asked always to guide that group. I love the women, and I just see that the week makes such a difference in their lives. And it's as coming to Israel has done for me. And so I'm really looking forward to that. It's a crazy week, lots of hard work all over the country, but it's incredibly rewarding on so many levels. So I hope you all have a fabulous week as well, a safe week. Hearts going out always to the people around the Gaza Strip, who's suffering so much from the fires that just don't end. And there were pictures in the Makor Rishon newspaper over Shabbat of the animals that have been killed there too. Like there's just all these, like people just aren't even thinking about all these things that are happening, like a burnt turtle. And it's just, yeah, obviously people are more important than animals, but the devastation to nature and to the environment is just overwhelming. And thoughts here as well to the boys in Thailand. Just because we are so immersed with what's happening here in Israel doesn't mean that we're not always focused also on what's happening globally, and hoping that these boys and their divers, because one of them has already paid for with his life, are able to come out to safety. And very proud of the Israelis who are also there helping with communications and helping with the advice. Wherever there's a crisis in the world, be it an earthquake or whatever, you'll find Israelis there. And I know that if ever I'm in trouble anywhere, I want to hear Hebrew, because our guys and gals just get out there, risk their own lives, but we care about humanity. And unfortunately, we very often have the experience here in dealing with crises in order to help others. But that's what we're all about. So thanks to Ben and to Tabitha, to everybody at the station. You can write to me. I always love hearing from you. Eve@thelandofisrael.com. Have a wonderful week, everybody. I'm in Jerusalem. I hope you will be too very, very soon. Take care, everybody. Goodbye for now.
This is a very amazing opportunity that God gave us with social media to get the whole world involved in things with just the click of a button.
Josh Haston here. Israel Uncensored on the Land of Israel Network at thelandofisrael.com. Check out my show this week. We'll be speaking to Eliakim Cohen, the head of Jews News. He is taking on the Israel Roadshow to bring the realities of the situation here in the state of Israel, get a glimpse of life in Israel, the people in Israel, what makes Israel tick, all of that, and much, much more news. All the latest here on Israel Uncensored on the Land of Israel Network.